So today we're going to get into optic heights and if they matter or not. Now the history around this topic is fairly interesting, and we're going to kind of deep dive into a handful of different optics heights. And what we need to keep in mind is that while there are a lot of different ones out there, especially ones now above 2.26, we're going to concentrate on the big four, okay, which is lower 1/3, 193, 226. The fourth one is going to be kind of vague because this is where the way we're going to kind of try to categorize it is basically ones where you lose your cheek weld, okay? So the GBRS Mount, the mount I have in my Mark 12, the Badger mount, these kind of fall into that category. And then above 2.26 is, where we're seeing a lot of these, and they're becoming way more and more popular as time goes on. So just kind of brush on optic heights as a whole. If you look back, we were really all about optics being close as the bore as we possibly can. This is seen through the original CCO mount that the military issued, and then as time goes on, we started seeing the carry handle mounted optics that Delta was running, and then as Special Forces as well. And we went from having, a very tall or high optic mounts, and then we wanted to shrink them all the way back down, like what I said with the original CCO mount. This is kind of where co-witness came into play. This is kind of where lower 1/3 came into play. Once we started implementing gear into the picture, like gas masks, vests, and helmets, then we started seeing, lower 1/3 really start to make its stride. And then as time has gone on, I would say 2018 and up, this is when we started seeing the 193s, the 2.26s and above. And I would say really heavily the last 5 years or so is when 2.26 and then the amounts above that really started to take off as well. Now you might be asking yourself, okay, how do I know which one's good for me? How do these feel? Where is it applicable? And really what it boils down to is three specific points, okay? One, what platform is it going on? What is your philosophy of use with that platform? And then how do you connect/mount a rifle? And when I say connect/mount a rifle, I mean, how are you shouldering it? What is your rifle to body connection? And we'll kind of go into the weeds on all these here in just a minute. So let's touch on our first point, which is, what platform is this going on? We'll use precision rifles as our first example. If you look at precision rifles as a whole, not looking at their offset dots, you're gonna see operators, end users, SWAT guys, they're all running typically lower 1/3 at highest. What you commonly see is co-witness, okay? And this is done because, well, for the simple fact that if you go prone or you have to sit in a position that's 193 and above for a very long time, your neck is not gonna be loving you, and it's a very painful and not repeatable sight picture through that scope, and you have to sit there very uncomfortable the whole time. Now, when it comes to the offset dots we see on those platforms, those are typically like 226 and above, and we'll show you that here in just a few with the Badger mount that I have on my Mark 12. Now there are a few cases where a 193 or a 226 even could make sense on a scope platform, and that's typically with LPVOs, like 1-8s, 1-10s at most. Typically those are shot from a kneeling or standing position, especially like patrol officers running that for their patrol rifles and such. I can understand that, but talking again, that's platform specific, right? There's a big difference between a precision platform, a sniper rifle platform, and then one we just kind of put an LPVO on, like a 16-inch AR with an LPVO. There's a big difference between the two of those. Joe with Bruiser Industries does a very good breakdown of that. If you guys want to head over to his video and take a look at that, I highly suggest it. To kind of further point out, so with DMRs, you'll commonly see the stock has adjustable cheek welds and even like a monopod in the back. That adjustable cheek weld in the back is what can kind of make sense if you want to run a higher optic. Again, that's a very niche exception, but it's still an exception, right? The next big example with this is like shotguns or hunting type rifles. Because of where the stock connects in your shoulder and where it sits on the rail, like where the iron sights sit versus where the gun is mounted, putting a 193 or a 226 mount on those type of platforms just wouldn't make any sense, even from a cheek weld standpoint. We also, there's a thing called height over bore, right? So when we run into shooting hunting rifles and shotguns at those particular distances, 25 yards to 50 yards, you're gonna have, sometimes, depending on the optic and depending where it's zeroed, a ridiculous amount of offset. But also just from a comfortability standpoint, we typically see shotgun mounts being run at a lower 1/3 on the highest end, and probably a co-witness most commonly if people are putting optics on their shotguns. Same thing with bolt action rifles, just because of the way they sit in the shoulder, the way they're mounted too, it's very comfortable to have a co-witness red dot or maybe a lower 1/3 red dot. Now when we start stretching into AR type rifles, AK type rifles, any modern type of fighting rifle, or just semi-automatic rifle that takes a 30-round mag, etc. We typically start seeing all of the above, right? We start seeing co-witness on some of those platforms, lower 1/3, probably most commonly at this point, I'd say almost 99% of optics you buy right now in the industry come with a lower 1/3 mount out of the box, so it's definitely the most common. But typically right now, especially what's hitting full stride is 193, 226, and then all the categories above that. Now, again, this is a big if, or there's a big question mark around this. You can still have an AR type platform that is precision built, right? So then we kind of revert back to our first point where, you know, if you're sitting in a prone position for a long time, a 226 mount or a 193, maybe even a lower 1/3 is just not going to be a good time for your neck. Okay, so it all depends, and this is kind of where the second bullet point, what we originally talked about, comes into play, which is philosophy of use. We did kind of touch on this just a little bit, but you know, to kind of give you guys a broader idea, it just doesn't refer to a hunting rifle or a sniper rifle, right? Like this can refer to a gun you want to run night vision specific, right? So a higher mount, while it's not required, it makes running passive, like so, you know, bringing your monocular through an optic on a AR-15 type rifle or a rifle like it makes it very simple, okay? It doesn't, again, like I said, it's not required, but it makes this process very easy and very simple. It's kind of like the philosophy of, you know, running IR only lasers or lights on the same type of rifle for night vision use. You know, if you just wanted a gun that was good for low light, obviously running those attachments wouldn't make any sense. We can then correlate the same thing with optic height, okay? Like you can still use a lower 1/3 just fine with night vision, but the process is somewhat simplified with a 226. Again, not needed, but somewhat simplified. You know, they kind of further comment on that. If you guys watch our night vision video, Corey kind of found out, you know, a lower 1/3 mount is great, but when you implement the use of it with a vest and then also a helmet and then also night vision on top of that, that's when you kind of start to understand that maybe this isn't the greatest thing ever, okay? So that's where, again, where something like 193 or 226 can shine. The other thing a philosophy of use kind of applies to is like, if you work in a team, like are you a SWAT guy, are you some Fed or something like that? You know, typically these people are working in a team environment, right? Okay, so you're typically using tear gas or something of that type. Okay, so wearing a gas mask could be in your daily gear list and then something you're wearing on a daily basis. That's another situation where it then makes sense to have that higher mount. Then to kind of like, you know, touch on the hunting rifles and shotgun stuff again, the way those guns are built, the stock is not equal height with the mounting rail. Is typically set a little bit above it, so running that lower mount makes more sense. You're also in those, with those platforms, you're typically not wanting or needing the higher mounts, like for, let's just say night vision use. I know some people hunt hogs at night and such, but if we're talking like a bolt action platform, people running an aim point on a bolt action platform or like a red dot in a shotgun, a pump shotgun or something like that, you know, you typically will see lower 1/3 at its highest. Getting into our third and final bullet point with this, at least from my point of view, is how you connect to the rifle. And we'll run in some B-roll clips to kind of show you guys what I'm talking about here, but some folks really like to run their stock more in the pocket of the shoulder area, and that's totally fine. You commonly see that with co-witness mounts, lower 1/3 mounts, people running it in the pocket of the shoulder area. When you start getting to the higher mounts, the big advantage is that you can start sheeting these mounts deeper into the towards your center line or deeper into your chest, like chest plate area. And what that's basically doing is when you start putting a stock more center line with your body or putting more meat behind it, it makes recoil mitigation somewhat easier on you. Okay, I'm not saying you can completely cheat the fundamentals by running a rifle more center line, but there is a big difference between, you know, running a, let's just say a co-witness mount that's totally in your shoulder pocket versus running a 226 mount that you can cheat down and in towards your center line. They do have a different felt recoil impulse, especially for rifles that are super thumpy. I have noticed it to be a little bit of an advantage. We'll kind of dive deeper into that here in just a second when I start picking up these particular platforms. The other thing I think is a good honorable mention here is what you're okay with in terms of offset. For those that shoot rifles, you know, 10 yards and in, 5 yards and in, you have to understand that the higher you go with your optic mount, the unfortunate byproduct of that is if you're aiming at center at a USPSA target at 5 yards, you have to understand that depending on how high that optic is, you're going to have a 2 to 3 or even a 4-inch offset of where your point of impact, point of aim is. That's just something to keep in mind, and we'll kind of go into the rabbit hole with that here in just a few minutes. All right, so getting into our first mount here, which is the lower 1/3. If you guys have not seen the video that's based around this rifle, we did a video about how to build out a training rifle. You guys make sure you click over here to watch that video. Went through a lot of good information about this rifle in particular, then also how to set up a training rifle. In that video I mentioned, I went back to lower 1/3. I typically am always running 193 mounts or above, and I specifically went back to lower 1/3 for this rifle. The things that I've noticed with lower 1/3 that's really nice is one, the offset up close is like minimal. especially with an EOTech reticle. I know 7 yards in, all I have to do is put the bottom part of the EOTech reticle, that little hash part, over whatever it is, wherever it is I want the bullet to go. And for the most part, the bullet's gonna hit right there or just like a 1/4 inch below it. Running a lower mount makes that process easy. What I also have noticed too, that's pretty nice, is that when it comes to actually mounting the gun, getting into your shoulder and then presenting it up to target, you are getting a thorough 4 points of contact. Okay, so you obviously, we have 2 hands, that's 2 right there. We have third one in our shoulder, and then the 4th point of contact is our cheek weld. Now, it makes the gun a little bit easier in terms of predictability and repeatability when we can put our cheek in the same place every single time, knowing I can mash my cheek into this and find that optic very fluently, very quickly. That is nice to know, or nice to have. Okay, now the other thing I will say that can be viewed as a con or maybe as a pro to some is that now because of that, I have to mount the weapon in a different area than what I normally do. I normally run a gun more centerline, more on the outside of my chest plate. With this gun in particular, I have to place it more in the pocket of the shoulder area, and some people are not a fan of that. Some are totally cool with that. To me, I found that it doesn't really matter, but I do like it for this purpose. I've also noticed that this gun is very thumpy. Okay, like I don't have a muzzle brake or a suppressor or anything on here. I run the gas block all the way open, and I run a mil-spec trigger in it. And being able to have those thorough 4 points of contact and drive the gun in the way that it does, I've noticed that it seems to pull out the best in me when it comes to building a predictable and repeatable mount. I've kind of learned to like lower 1/3, but I will say, looking back at my early training days, I wasn't a huge fan of it. I went to 193 real quick and really liked it. Now that I've came back to revisit it, I actually think it's not as bad as I used to think it was. Also being said, this is the most common optic height you're gonna find, okay? So if you get stuck with a lower 1/3, it's not the end of the world. I just think you have to understand that you need to know where to connect with the rifle and where to put it, and that will kind of help you understand this mount height a little bit more. The other thing that's really cool about this mount height in particular is that most accessories made for these rifles are compatible with it. Okay, so like using the magnifier as an example, Vortex, EOTech, and a handful of others make magnifiers. Out of the box, they're typically gonna be completely compatible with coat witness or lower 1/3. So that kind of saves you a few bucks from having to buy an extra mount and stuff. I think it's also good to mention that, when it comes to beginner shooters, I do feel like the best habits surface when they have a mount around this height. When I start to see people utilizing a 226 mount and above, it almost seems like the fundamentals kind of fall apart. Either it's because they loosen up their offhand pressure and don't put enough pressure back into their shoulder mount, or they're just loosely gripping the rifle with like 0 hand tension, no leverage and friction, etc., etc. That seems to be kind of up and out of the way when it comes to running a lower 1/3 mount. It also helps people understand that the 4th point of contact, being your cheek, can be advantageous depending on what you want to do with the gun. And then also, if we're looking at a military standpoint, if you look at like military marksmanship, like literally in the Army handbook, it specifically mentions, nose to charging handle, right? And that's kind of where this mount stemmed from, or that the history on this mount stemmed from. So it's friendly for troops to be taught in the masses. It's probably friendly for newer shooters as well. It does make sense and it does correlate. So next up is my Triarch here. I have a ScalarWorks 193 on top of this with an aimpoint T2. To me, as of right now, November of 2025, I think 193 is the best height mount out there. It's kind of a hill I'm willing to die on at this point. And again, I know that's a very subjective statement, so believe me, I understand that. But for what I want out of a rifle, for what I do with rifles, nowadays, which is a ton of training and a lot of low light use, a lot of duty use, 193 is extremely beneficial, okay? Like I talked about earlier, from a gear standpoint, you're not always gonna get the best mount when you're running plate carriers or like soft body carriers like what I wear for work, and then also to train in, and then also for night vision use. Like 193 is not quite as low as lower 1/3, it's also not quite as high as 226. So you're not putting your neck and your posture in this weird position to be able to shoot utilizing the dot under night vision instead of utilizing a laser, shooting passively, otherwise known as. And to me, that's kind of what made this mount worth the squeeze. This being said, the one thing that can be kind of the downside, and I've found myself making the mistake, is offset. Okay, so offset it, 5 yards, 7 yards and in. It can be pretty rough depending on the size of target you want to shoot. Like hitting an A zone in those distances is obviously not difficult. You really just hold top the A zone, you're going to be hitting center of the A zone. But if you really want to start like hitting the A zone of a head box, let's just say, using an example, a USPSA target, hitting the A zone of that head box, you do have to take some time to train and know that offset. Otherwise, it's going to make a fool of you every single time. It's not quite as easy as lower 1/3. Lower 1/3, you basically put 1.5 inches, 2 inches above it, and you're going to have desired impacts of where do you want the bullet to go. This is not quite the same boat. The other thing that's really nice about 193 is it clears everything in front of the gun. Okay, the one, a big downside I noticed to lower 1/3, especially early on, you can see about 1/4 of your laser if you have anything mounted in the front of the gun. You can see like in the bottom part of the optic, like about 1/4 of the optic, you can see the laser or the light, and that's very annoying to me. With the 193, you don't have that problem. You get clear sight alignment every single time. There's nothing in the way, there's no iron sights in the way, there's no lasers or lights in the way, just dot and clearness the whole way through. So this is very much what I prefer right now. I think another good thing to mention here is the mounting portion to it. I know I touched on it a little bit, but to kind of get more in the weeds on it, I feel like in terms of a body to rifle connection, it is the perfect sweet spot from being able to cheat more center line and more on your chest plate and not so quite pocketed at the shoulder. I prefer to have guns as center line as I can, just for recoil mitigation purposes. Again, it's not a required thing, but like I said in the beginning, how you connect to the rifle, which is independent and different amongst everybody, is a very large consideration to take into play here. And because I connect to the rifle the way that I do, I feel like this is the best in between. So next up here, we have a 226 mount on top of my Jack carbine. Not gonna lie to you guys, I was gonna go into this video talking mad crap on the 226 because I used to absolutely despise this mount. When I first bought my Radian Mod 1, I ran a 226, or lower 1/3 tan EOTech with this Unity Tactical 226 mount, and I hated it. Like, from the first round I fired out of it to the last, I absolutely hated it. And looking back on it, it's because I didn't change where I was mounting the rifle, so I didn't change my body to rifle connection. And it completely haunted me for the 2,000 rounds that I left that specific mount on that gun. And I left it just with a horrible taste in my mouth, and I never revisited it after because I thought it was just complete trash. The other thing I was not a huge fan of was the offset you have at close distances. If you're running an EOTech, you basically have to hold a whole reticle above and then some to basically put bullets where you want them to go, depending on how demanding the size of the target is. When it comes to an A zone, if you hold top of the A zone, you're gonna impact center of it. But if you're talking like A zone of the head box, that's when it gets like really tricky, okay? And you really have to, that can all be fixed with training. Let's just preface that real quick. But you really have to hammer that out in the range to understand that offset. And running this, and when we filmed this video, I threw this specific mount back on this rifle. And when we were shooting, I was like, damn, okay, this actually isn't as bad as I remember. Kind of made me open my eyes up a little bit to maybe be not so subjective and not be so harsh on the taller optics, because I now, I've obviously since the 2 years ago or 3 years ago that I did that with that specific optic height, a lot has changed about where I've been in my shooting journey and where I am. And now I understand that, like, hey, if you want to run these taller mounts, one of the things you have to change is where you're mounting the gun. That's where you're going to get the most squeeze out of the optic height. Obviously that and a few other things like, gear wise and night vision wise and stuff, it's obviously makes these things and these processes easier. It's not required, but easier. So now knowing that, I think the 226 mount is awesome. Okay, especially when it's combined with an EOTech. I can basically put this right over my chest plate or right on the edge of my chest plate and super center line with my body. And all I have to do is kind of scrunch my shoulders up a little bit and do a shrimping effect with my shoulders when I come up and present to shoot. And the dot is sitting in a place where it needs to be every single time. Also shooting it, you guys will see in the B-roll, the gun is just completely flat. It's very obviously plain as day, predictable and repeatable, and you can just eat your dinner off the top of it. And after shooting a well-gassed rifle with a 226 mount, I was like, dang, okay, this really is pretty sweet. Now, what I will say, I did try it in the video, is when you put a gun that has this mount on it in like, let's just say the shoulder pocket, it almost seems like you're losing leverage over the rifle. And if that's how you mount, I say mount, I mean body to rifle connection. So if that's how you're connecting to the rifle, utilizing a mount of this height, that's when I start to, understand that, yeah, you're probably not gonna like it because the way you connect to the rifle is not conducive to the mount height. So you're gonna start to notice you're gonna get a little bit more flip. Like for me, I'm a lefty, so gun will go high and left if I'm not doing my homework fundamentally. If you're right-handed, it'll start moving high and right, okay, under recoil. Just understand, like the biggest glowing thing out of all these so far, the higher you go with the optic mount, the deeper you can go when it comes to how you connect to the rifle and where it sits in your shoulder, chest plate, center line, whatever it is that you prefer. That is like the glowing thing to take away here. Another good thing about the 226 mount is night vision use, okay? Like I said at the beginning of the video, it is not required, but holy cow, does it make it easier, okay? You basically can keep a same upright posture when shooting with a 226 mount, and For some people, that's totally worth it. I'm totally here for that. I think it makes sense. The other thing is if you're wearing gear. This is another thing where it just completely shines. Okay, so plate carriers, helmets, I would say gas masks are a big, huge thing. Like if you want to get around shooting in a gas mask, you're gonna have to do one of two things. You're either gonna need to make the optic height insanely high, or you're gonna have to use a very, very good visible laser. Okay, that's basically how you get around shooting in a gas mask, because you can do it utilizing a lower 1/3, but it's not gonna be a good time for you, and you're not gonna mount the gun the way that you want to, okay? So, to me, you know, now the 226 mount has proved its value to me, and I'm probably gonna end up keeping it on this rifle going forward. Now you guys will see here on my Mark 12, I have a Badger Ordnance mount. This is a co-witness mount, and then I also have the T2 mounted up top. Okay, but I will say this too. You guys also notice on the bottom of the rifle here, I have what inherently comes with the Mark 12, which is like this scope riser. This is kind of so it can cheat off of or sit up off of the lasers and stuff you may have mounted in the front. I did take my laser off for the video, but I normally have a hollow sun mount here in the front, and it's nice because I don't get any, I will not see that through the scope when I have it mounted up here, okay? So that's why it's nice to have it up on this little riser here. This all being said, it puts this aim point at like skyscraper level height. It is high. It is high enough to the point where you do not get a cheek weld, which is like when you used to mount the red dots on the side of the AK mounting rail versus just like the top rail that they all come with now. Before, you basically at best had a chin weld when you'd put an optic on an AK. That's obviously since changed going forward, but this is what that is most similar to. Like you're at best getting a chin weld. And I will say when it comes to a big thing to take away from that, you're obviously not trying to do up close nasty stuff. Like the red dot for this gun in particular is there to make, you know, shooting 50 yards and in a lot easier on a scope platform. This is not a main engagement strategy for this rifle. It's there for the, you know, when you go inside a structure, or if you have the engagements 50 yards and in. It's really nice to have a red dot for that. And even in those distances, the offset can be pretty crazy, but as long as you zero it at an okay distance, like for this one I chose 36 yards, I haven't seen any noticeable offset issues at 100 yards either. So I don't ever shoot the red dot past 100 yards. I would just use my scope for that. But you know, kind of giving you guys some data points as I go along here. What I have noticed, especially shooting up close and nasty with this rifle like we did for the video, when I come up for a presentation on this gun, I am basically relying off training and experience to put the dot where I need it to be, okay? For some people, that's fine. For others who don't have the experience or the training, it's a nightmare, okay? Especially when you're trying to do it fast at speed. It's a huge problem, okay? It is hard, it can be predictable and it can be repeatable, but only with a very large amount of training. And for this type of platform, it's just not something I'm focusing on. I'm more worried about knowing my hold unders and holdovers with the scope and shooting at distance with the scope, because to me that's a way harder thing to do than shoot up close and nasty with a 12 o'clock mounted red dot. The one thing I wanted to add real quick, especially with these taller mounts, this goes for like 193 and above, 226 and above, target transitions, okay? Because for the most part, depending on how steep the transition is, you are breaking cheek weld from the gun. You're obviously looking first, gun's following. With the rifle, because it's connected to your body, it almost can feel simultaneous, but I have noticed with the taller mounts, when you have to break and look somewhere else to move the gun, you almost kind of lose reference of where the gun comes in and where the dot can come in. Again, this can all be fixed with training, but I just kind of want to throw that bullet point out there for you guys. You know, the other thing is too, we can circle back to night vision. It's obviously great for night vision use because you basically do not have to move your neck at all, or even have to shrug your shoulders at all. It's nice for gear, sure. Yeah, I don't think, again, that's not really the main use for it. But this is where it mostly shines for me, is the engagements 50 yards and in. And I also have noticed that the offset, even at like 5 yards and in, is really not crazy either. So even for that, I think it's still totally fine. Now, this being said, this optic height is somewhat similar to like kind of what we're seeing with the GBRS mounts. And there's a handful of others out there that are taller than 226. And like I said before, guys, those optic heights are fine. You as the end user determine what the value of something holds, okay? It's not up to me, the guy on the internet telling you what to do. You know, the end user determines the value of a product. If a GBRS mount makes sense in your day-to-day life, then it makes sense in your day-to-day life. There's no one that's gonna tell you differently. If running a LPVO and running a 12 o'clock amount of red dot on top is like the perfect squeeze for you, okay, that's what works, man, that's totally fine. The thing I would advocate is that if you're going to use these platforms, you just gotta train with them. And that's really what a lot of this boils down to. The topic of optic heights is often very black and white for people. Die-hard subject, people will die on the hill, like almost like what I did with the 193, and say that the others are wrong. Where I disagree in that you know, understanding is that when you start thinking other ways are wrong and only yours is right, that's obviously very biased, okay? And like what I told you guys at the 226, I went into it with a very biased point of view, and I came out like, okay, I'm definitely keeping that optic and that mount on that gun. It's not changing. Like, it's great. There isn't like the way to do things. There's a way. And the reason why these other optic heights exist is because other people have found value in other optic heights. Okay, so my suggestion for you is try them. These are not insanely expensive. The ScalarWorks mount and the Unity Tactical mount, they're $100 and below. Like, if you just want to buy a used one, you'll find one for like 50 bucks, 60 bucks on tax swap. My suggestion for you is to try this stuff. I was very hesitant to make these purchases at first. After I did them, I was like, okay, yeah, cool. Like, I'm glad I got it, because then I could use it for the review for this video. And then when I went back and revisited, let's just use 226 as an example. When I went back and revisited it, I ended up liking it so much to the point where I'm now keeping it on that rifle. I think a lot of this stuff you might not like at first. Give it the 1,000 round test or 2,000 round test to kind of, at least build some fundamental and some skill and speed behind it. And then after that, I think 1,000 rounds or 2,000 rounds is plenty enough to understand if you don't like something or do. When you're new to a process, everything feels uncomfortable. That's why I say, give it the 1,000 round, 2,000 round. A lot of people think that's a very high round count. For me personally, that is not a high round count at all. Okay, so that is plenty ample testing though. That being said, 1,000 rounds is plenty of reps and plenty of range sessions. Give this stuff a try for yourself. I highly encourage you guys also looking into zero distances, ballistic coefficients, and trying to correlate that with mount height. We didn't touch on that in this video because that's just way too sciencey for me. There are people more knowledgeable than me out there putting out videos like that, like I mentioned with Joe with Bruiser Industries, especially with scope-mounted platforms. Make sure you guys understand that when it comes to utilizing these mounts. And I think once you kind of put two and two together with zero distance, barrel length, optic height, you can start carving out an idea of what you want to move to next. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe so we can keep putting out information like this.